This is There's a Hole in the Bucket, adapted by John M. Feierabend and illustrated by Marissa, Madonna. There's a hole in the bucket, dear Liza, dear Liza. There's a hole in the bucket, dear Liza, a hole. Mend the hole in the bucket, dear Georgie, dear Georgie. Mend the hole in the bucket, dear Georgie, mend the hole. With what shall I mend it, dear Liza, dear Liza? With what shall I mend it, dear Liza? With what? With the straw, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, dear Georgie. With the straw, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, with the straw. The straw is too long, dear Liza, dear Liza. The straw is too long, dear Liza, too long. Then cut it, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, dear Georgie. Then cut it, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, cut it. With what shall I cut it, dear Liza, dear Liza? With what shall I cut it, dear Liza? With what? With a knife, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, dear Georgie. With a knife, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, a knife. The knife is too blunt, dear Liza, dear Liza. The knife is too blunt, dear Liza, too blunt. Wet the knife, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, dear Georgie. Wet the knife, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, wet it. With what shall I wet it, dear Liza, dear Liza? With what shall I wet it, dear Liza? With what? With a stone, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, dear Georgie. With a stone, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, a stone. The stone is too dry, dear Liza, dear Liza. The stone is too dry, dear Liza, too dry. Wet the stone then, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, dear Georgie. Wet the stone then, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, wet it. With what shall I wet it, dear Liza, dear Liza? With what shall I wet it, dear Liza? With what? With the water, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, dear Georgie. With the water, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, the water. In what shall I get it, dear Liza, dear Liza? In what shall I get it, dear Liza? In what? In the bucket, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, dear Georgie. In the bucket, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, the bucket. But there's a hole in the bucket, dear Liza, dear Liza. There's a hole in the bucket, dear Liza, a hole. Oh, whatever shall they do? Something fun about this song is you can sing all the words at the end of the book. Oh, and it says something interesting you might like to know. There's a Hole in the Bucket is a circle song, meaning it has no end. It could just go on and on forever. I wonder how many more verses you could come up with.